Nam Ki-jun's fist hit the glass table like a gunshot. The sound ricocheted through the penthouse boardroom, 53 floors above Seoul. 25 faces turned toward the tattooed man at the head of the table. Criminal masterminds. Ex-bankers who'd sold their souls. Lawyers who traded their licenses for blood money. Accountants who knew where every dirty dollar in Asia was hidden. 4 weeks they'd been locked in this room. 4 weeks burning through $2 million in consulting fees. And they were exactly nowhere. $200 million. Nam's voice was controlled rage, the kind that preceded executions. Interpol seizes it in 72 hours, and every person in this room spends the rest of their lives in a cage. Silence. The kind of expensive silence that costs countries their economies and men their freedom. Park Jae-sung, Nam's underboss, loosened his Hami's tie and dared to speak. The Luxembourg structure is compromised. Every shell corporation we've built over 15 years, flagged. The Joint Task Force has forensic accountants who. I know what they have. Nam's neck tattoos, intricate Korean characters spelling out names of the dead, flexed as he spoke. I'm paying you to tell me what we have. More silence. 25 brilliant criminals, and not one solution. Behind them, floor-to-ceiling windows framed Seoul's glittering skyline. Billions of dollars flowing through those buildings every second. Legal money. Illegal money. Money that needed washing, hiding, moving through borders without leaving fingerprints. Money that was about to bury them all. CTA. Before we go any further, if you want to see how Mildred survives what's coming next, if you want to know the one word that saves $200 million, if you care whether her brother lives or dies, hit that subscribe button right now. Not later. Right now. Because I spend hours crafting these stories, and when you subscribe, you're telling me it matters. Drop a comment with where you're watching from, New York, London, Tokyo, Lagos. I want to know who's on this journey with me. Subscribe. Comment your location. Let's go. Intro. Nam Ki-jun was 38 years old and had never failed at anything that mattered. He'd built an empire that stretched from Seoul to Singapore to the Cayman Islands. An empire invisible to law enforcement until 3 months ago, when one careless banker in Luxembourg had left a digital trail that lit up Interpol's radar like a Christmas tree. Now the clock was ticking. And the most expensive criminal minds in Asia were failing him. Run it again, Nam said quietly. Dangerous quiet. The lead strategist, a former Deutsche Bank executive named Klaus Werner who'd fled Germany after a money laundering scandal, pulled up the digital presentation. Projected across the far wall, a maze of corporate entities lit up in red. Shell companies. Offshore accounts. Cryptocurrency wallets. Every avenue they'd used to move $200 million in gray market funds, which was criminal speak for money stolen from pension funds, insurance fraud, and trafficking operations across 12 countries. All of it compromised. All of it flagged. All of it about to be seized by international authorities who'd been building this case for 18 months. We've explored every option, Klaus said, his German accent thick with exhaustion. Cyprus banking is tightened post-crisis. Singapore has new transparency laws. Even the Caymans are cooperating with. I didn't ask for a list of problems. Nam's eyes were black ice. I asked for solutions. Klaus fell silent. Across the table, Park Jae-sung glared at the others with open contempt. Park was Nam's enforcer, his underboss, his right hand for a decade. He'd personally recruited most of these experts from the wreckage of their former legitimate careers. And right now, he wanted to put bullets in every one of them. For weeks, Park said, his voice dripping venom. 25 people. $80,000 a day in fees. And you've given us nothing. One of the accountants, a nervous man named Chen who'd been embezzling from Hong Kong banks for 15 years, opened his mouth to respond. Park slammed his hand on the table. If you say we're close one more time, I will personally throw you off this balcony and let Seoul clean you off the pavement. Chen closed his mouth. The tension in the room was suffocating. Lethal. This was how people died in Nam Ki-jun's world, not with dramatic shootouts, but with quiet failures in expensive boardrooms. One mistake. One missed deadline. One problem they couldn't solve. And you became a name tattooed on someone's neck. Nam stood, his 6-foot frame casting shadows across the table. The suit he wore was Bryony, custom-tailored, cut to barely conceal the ink that marked his past. Each tattoo represented someone he'd lost. Someone he'd loved. Someone he'd killed. There were 17 names on his skin. He had room for 25 more. "We reconvene in 1 hour," Nam said. "Come back with something useful, or don't come back at all." The executives began gathering their laptops, their tablets, their files marked confidential, that would be burned in industrial incinerators if Interpol ever got close enough to raid. And that's when she walked in. Mildred Hughes was invisible. That was the point. 26 years old, Black American, standing 5'6" in Converse sneakers that had seen better days. She wore a bright yellow leather jacket, the only splash of color in this world of black suits and gray morality, and carried a bamboo tray with 25 fresh cups of coffee. She'd been serving these men for 4 weeks. Not one of them had ever looked her in the eye. Not one of them knew her name. She was the help. The coffee girl. The invisible woman who refilled cups and cleared plates while they discussed federal crimes and international fraud in 3 different languages, assuming she was too stupid or too unimportant to understand. They were wrong on both counts. Mildred had graduated summa cum laude from UCLA with a degree in international economics. She could read a balance sheet faster than most CFOs. She spoke conversational Korean, passable Mandarin, and could identify money laundering patterns the way sommeliers identified wine regions. But none of that mattered when your 19-year-old brother was dying in a Los Angeles hospital, drowning in $340,000 of medical debt from kidney failure, and you needed $8,000 a month just to keep him on the transplant list. So she served coffee to criminals. And she kept her mouth shut. And she pretended not to notice the glaring, catastrophic mistake they'd been making for 4 weeks straight, the mistake that was going to cost them $200 million and their freedom. Mildred moved through the room like a ghost, setting down cups with practiced efficiency. Dark roast for Klaus. Americano for Park. Green tea for Chen, who didn't drink coffee but nobody cared enough to remember. She'd memorized all of their preferences because that's what invisible people do. They notice everything and say nothing. Park didn't even look up when she placed his cup down. But his elbow, deliberate, violent, knocked the entire tray from her hands. Coffee exploded across the table. Brown liquid splashed across financial documents, laptops, her yellow jacket. The room went silent. Mildred stood there, dripping, humiliated. Park looked at her like she was a stain on his shoe. "Clean it up," he said. "And try not to be so clumsy next time." Every executive in that room knew it wasn't an accident. Every executive in that room looked away. Mildred felt the heat of rage burning through her chest. 4 weeks of watching these overpaid criminals fumble the simplest offshore restructuring she'd ever seen. 4 weeks of being treated like furniture. 4 weeks of biting her tongue while her brother's kidneys failed 3,000 miles away. She grabbed napkins from the tray, started wiping the table. And that's when she saw it. The digital projection still glowing on the wall. The corporate structure they'd been arguing over for a month. Luxembourg entities connected to Singapore branches connected to Cayman accounts. All flagged. All compromised. All missing the one jurisdiction that would have saved everything. The words left her mouth before her brain could stop them. Cyprus. One word. Barely a whisper. But in that silent room, it hit like thunder. Every head turned. 25 executives stared at the coffee girl who'd just spoken. Park's face darkened. "What did you say?" Mildred's heart was hammering. She'd just broken the cardinal rule, invisible people don't speak. But she was already in it now, standing in her coffee-stained yellow jacket, holding wadded napkins, staring at men who killed people for smaller offenses than interrupting their meetings. Her voice came out stronger than she felt. "Cyprus. You're missing Cyprus." Nam Ki-jun turned slowly. His eyes, cold, calculating, lethal, locked onto hers for the first time in 4 weeks. The coffee trembled in Mildred's hands as she approached the conference table, amber liquid catching the recessed lighting like liquid gold. She'd polished that table 3 times this morning. Once wasn't enough for men who measured worth in zeros, and now she moved across its reflection like a ghost crossing still water. The Korean executives didn't look up. They never did. She set the first cup before Mr. Park, the oldest, whose Patek Philippe caught the light with more warmth than his eyes ever had. Then Mr. Choi, scrolling through his phone with the casual indifference of someone who'd never wondered if he could afford dinner and rent in the same week. Finally Mr. Kim, the youngest at 42, who at least had the decency to grunt something that might have been acknowledgement or might have been indigestion. Will there be anything else? Mildred's voice carried the practiced neutrality she'd perfected over 8 months of serving coffee to men in $15,000 suits. Silence. Not even the courtesy of a dismissive wave. She was furniture. Expensive furniture, given the golden leather jacket she'd been required to wear, the uniform that marked her as staff at the Palazzo Constellation, Los Angeles' newest monument to excess. The jacket probably cost more than her monthly salary. She couldn't afford to spill anything on it. Mildred backed away from the table, her reflection fragmenting across the polished surface until she disappeared entirely. That's what she was here, a fragmented thing, a partial presence, visible only when someone needed something and invisible the moment they had it. The phone in her pocket buzzed. She pulled it out in the service corridor, away from the judging eyes of security cameras and supervisors who tracked bathroom breaks like classified intelligence. Danny, visiting hours end at 8. You coming? Her little brother. 19 years old and rotting in a hospital bed at Cedars-Sinai because his appendix had decided to rupture on a Tuesday, which was apparently the most expensive day of the week to need emergency surgery. The initial bill had come to $47,000. For a burst appendix. For something that happened to thousands of people every year, something routine, something fixable, $47,000 they didn't have. Mildred, I'll be there. 6:30. She wouldn't be there at 6:30. Her shift didn't end until 7, and the buses from Wilshire to the hospital took 40 minutes if traffic was merciful, which it never was. Danny knew this. She knew this. They performed this small fiction every day because the alternative was admitting that her brother spent his visiting hours alone, staring at a television he couldn't afford to have turned on because even the hospital entertainment system required a credit card. The debt haunted her like a second shadow. $47,000 for the surgery. Another $12,000 for the complications, the infection they said was rare but not rare enough to prevent, the additional antibiotics, the extended stay. $59,000. The number had its own gravity now, its own mass, pulling everything else in her life into its orbit until nothing existed except the debt and her desperate attempts to escape it. She tried everything. Applied for charity care, denied because she made $32 too much per month to qualify. Negotiated a payment plan, approved for monthly installments of $800, which was $400 more than her share of rent. Applied for medical credit, denied because her credit score had been destroyed by student loans for a degree she'd never finished. She was trapped in a maze designed by people who'd never needed to navigate it, every exit leading back to the same impossible choice: pay the debt or pay for living. The golden leather jacket felt heavier now, grotesque against her skin. She was wearing someone's monthly mortgage payment while her brother recovered in a hospital room that cost more per night than she made in a week. The math didn't work. Nothing about this worked. Back on the floor, she refilled water glasses at a table where 3 women discussed their upcoming trip to Santorini with the bored enthusiasm of people who'd already been to Santorini twice. She cleared plates at the bar where a venture capitalist explained to his date why disrupting the healthcare industry was actually a moral imperative, as if the current system wasn't already disrupted enough. She smiled. She nodded. She made herself small and pleasant and invisible. At 6:47 p.m., she clocked out and ran for the bus, the golden jacket stuffed into her backpack because she couldn't afford to lose it or damage it or exist in it 1 second longer than required. The bus was late. Traffic was biblical. She arrived at Cedars-Sinai at 7:52, 8 minutes before visiting hours ended. Danny was asleep when she slipped into his room, his face gray against white pillows, and 4 dripping clear fluid that probably cost $40 per bag. She sat in the chair by his bed and watched him breathe, each breath adding another $1 to a debt that would outlive them both. She was invisible to everyone who mattered. But here, in this overpriced room, with her brother's hand cool in hers, Mildred existed completely. For 8 minutes, she was seen. The floor-to-ceiling windows of Nam Ki-jun's penthouse boardroom offered a god's-eye view of Manhattan, but nobody was admiring the scenery. 25 of the world's most wanted financial criminals occupied the leather chairs around the obsidian conference table, and the room crackled with the kind of tension that preceded either brilliant solutions or violent endings. "The Luxembourg entities are compromised," announced a sharp-faced woman in Armani, her Korean accent clipping each word. Interpol has flagged all 7 shell corporations. They're connecting the dots. The digital screens covering the eastern wall displayed a dizzying web of offshore structures, corporations nested within corporations, trusts feeding into foundations, accounts bouncing between Cayman, Singapore, and Cyprus. $200 million in stolen assets, carefully laundered through a dozen jurisdictions, now glowing red with exposure warnings. A man with prison tattoos barely concealed by his Bryony suit slammed his fist on the table. "This is unacceptable. We paid top dollar for those structures. Someone fucked up." "Nobody fucked up," Nam Ki-jun's voice cut through the argument like a blade through silk. He stood at the head of the table, immaculate in navy chiton, his expression carved from ice. The regulatory environment shifted. The EU's beneficial ownership registries went live last quarter. "We adapt or we burn." The room erupted into overlapping conversations, Korean, English, Mandarin, Russian, as criminals argued about next moves. Some wanted to abandon the Luxembourg route entirely. Others advocated for deeper complexity, more layers, additional jurisdictions. A silver-haired man suggested simply bribing the right officials in Brussels. Mildred stood against the back wall, iPad in hand, theoretically present to take notes and refresh drinks. She'd become furniture in these meetings, invisible, ignored, beneath notice. The hired help. She'd learned to make herself small, to fade into the expensive wallpaper, to become the kind of presence people forgot the moment she left the room. But she wasn't taking notes on their arguments. Her eyes tracked the data on the screens, following the money trails with an intensity she carefully kept off her face. Years of night school accounting classes had taught her to read financial structures the way other people read newspapers. And what she was seeing made her pulse quicken. The Luxembourg problem was real, but it wasn't the real problem. The screens showed a classic offshore architecture, shell companies owning shell companies, each layer theoretically adding protection through complexity. But Mildred could see the gap they'd all missed, the structural flaw that would bring the entire edifice crashing down regardless of whether Interpol flagged Luxembourg or not. "We need a new jurisdiction," the Armani woman was saying. "Malta, perhaps. Or the British Virgin Islands with updated nominee structures." "The BVI is too obvious," countered a younger man with expensive dental work. "Everyone uses the BVI. That's exactly why it's under scrutiny." "Then where?" The man with the tattoos spread his hands. "Every decent financial haven is under pressure now. The whole game has changed." Nam Ki-jun turned toward the screens, studying the red-flagged entities with narrowed eyes. "The jurisdictions don't matter if the underlying structure is sound. We don't need a new location. We need a better architecture." "The architecture is fine," insisted the woman. 7 layers of corporate separation, each jurisdiction with different transparency requirements. This is textbook offshore planning. Mildred's fingers tightened on her iPad. It wasn't fine. The structure had a fatal flaw, and every second they spent arguing about Luxembourg instead of fixing it was another second closer to total exposure. The gap wasn't in any single jurisdiction, it was in how the jurisdictions connected to each other, a missing link in the chain of ownership that would allow investigators to collapse 7 layers into one. She knew she should stay quiet. Speaking up meant revealing that she understood what she was looking at, that she'd been studying their operations instead of just serving their coffee. It meant stepping out of the shadows into a spotlight she couldn't control, making herself visible to people who disappeared problems permanently. But if she stayed quiet, this entire operation would implode within months. Interpol wouldn't need to flag Luxembourg, they'd follow the paper trail straight through the gap in the structure, and everyone in this room would spend the next decade in federal prison. Including Nam Ki-jun. She glanced at him, still studying the screens with that expression of controlled fury he wore when problems defied immediate solutions. He'd built this empire through ruthless intelligence and meticulous planning, surrounding himself with experts who'd forgotten more about financial crime than most people would ever learn. But he'd missed this. They'd all missed it. The argument continued to swirl around her: jurisdictions, transparency requirements, regulatory arbitrage. 25 brilliant criminals focused on the wrong problem entirely, rushing toward a cliff they couldn't see. Mildred took a breath and stepped forward from the wall. "Excuse me," she said quietly, "but Luxembourg isn't your problem." The room went absolutely silent. The boardroom fell silent as Park's coffee arced through the air in what couldn't possibly be an accident. The scalding liquid splashed across Mildred's borrowed jacket, the one she'd painstakingly pressed that morning, and dripped onto the polished mahogany table. "Oh, how clumsy of me," Park said, his voice dripping with false concern. He made no move to help, instead straightening his Hermes tie with a satisfied smirk. Perhaps the help should stick to cleaning rather than pretending to understand international finance. The words hit harder than the coffee. Mildred stood frozen, feeling the heat spread across her chest, not from the liquid, but from the humiliation burning through her veins. Around the table, executives shifted uncomfortably, some staring at their laptops, others suddenly fascinated by the Manhattan skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. No one spoke. No one defended her. Christina's hand touched her arm, a gentle warning to let it go. The pressure said everything: don't make this worse. Don't give him ammunition. Don't throw away everything we've built. But something in Mildred's chest was splitting open. She'd spent 3 years invisible in these hallways, 3 years overhearing conversations that shaped billion-dollar decisions, 3 years watching powerful people make moves she understood better than they did. 3 years silent. The coffee dripped onto her shoes, the sensible ones she'd bought at Payless, not the Louboutins that cost more than her monthly rent. Park was already turning away, dismissing her existence with a wave of his hand, when Mildred's lips parted. "Cyprus." The word came out quietly at first, barely more than a whisper. But in the silence of the boardroom, it might as well have been a gunshot. Park stopped mid-stride. Several executives looked up from their phones. Christina's grip on Mildred's arm tightened. "What did you say?" Mr. Blackwood's voice cut through the room like steel. Mildred's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to apologize, to retreat, to become invisible again. But she'd crossed the threshold now. There was no going back. "Cyprus," she repeated, louder this time. Her voice shook, but she forced herself to meet Park's incredulous stare. "Your EU banking strategy. You've missed Cyprus entirely." Park's face flushed red. "This is absurd. Security should escort." "Let her speak." Mr. Blackwood's command silenced the room. He leaned forward in his chair, those calculating eyes fixed on Mildred with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Explain yourself, Ms. Hayes." The use of her actual name felt surreal. Mildred's mouth went dry. Around the table, 20 of the most powerful people in international finance were staring at her, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed contempt. Park looked ready to commit murder. "The Cyprus banking sector," Mildred began, her voice steadier now, "operates under special EU provisions that none of your models account for. When you move capital through their correspondent banks using the framework you're proposing, you trigger Article 63 TFU reporting requirements that your current structure can't handle." She could see them processing her words, some reaching for tablets, others exchanging glances. Park's face had gone from red to pale. That's classified strategic information," he sputtered. "How would a cleaning woman possibly—" "She wouldn't," Mr. Blackwood interrupted, still watching Mildred. "Unless she's been paying attention. Continue, Ms. Hayes." Mildred swallowed hard. The coffee was cooling on her jacket, making her shiver, but she pressed on. "Your Luxembourg structure assumes standard EU banking protocols, but Cyprus has bilateral agreements with non-EU states that create transparency requirements. When you route through their banks, you're not just dealing with EU law, you're triggering disclosure obligations to third countries. Your shell corporations become visible." The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Mildred watched Mr. Blackwood's face, trying to read the expression in those cold eyes. Was it anger? Interest? Calculation? Finally, he spoke. Ms. Chen, verify what she's saying. Christina's fingers flew across her tablet, her face tight with concentration. The seconds stretched out like hours. Mildred could feel Park's fury radiating across the room, could sense the other executives recalibrating their assessment of the nobody in the coffee-stained jacket. She's right, Christina said quietly, her voice carrying a note of disbelief. Cyprus Banking Decree 2013, subsection 4.7. Special bilateral transparency provisions with Russia, Israel, and Lebanon. Our current structure would trigger automatic disclosure within 72 hours of any transaction over 10 million euros. The room erupted. Voices overlapped as executives pulled up documents, made urgent phone calls, recalculated projections. In the chaos, Mr. Blackwood remained perfectly still, his gaze never leaving Mildred's face. How long have you known about this? He asked. Mildred's throat tightened. 3 weeks. I heard Park presenting the strategy in the hallway outside your office. And you said nothing? I'm a cleaning woman, sir. Who would have listened? The elevator doors had barely begun to close when a hand shot between them, forcing them open with a metallic groan. Mildred's heart seized as Nam stepped inside, his presence filling the cramped space like smoke filling a room. The doors slid shut behind him with a finality that made her skin crawl. Going down? His voice was conversational, almost pleasant, as if they just bumped into each other at a coffee shop rather than in a service elevator after she'd stumbled onto evidence of his criminal empire. Mildred pressed herself against the elevator wall, her cleaning cart a flimsy barrier between them. I was just running. Nam finished her sentence, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. I don't blame you. Most people would. He reached past her, his arm brushing her shoulder as he pressed the emergency stop button. The elevator shuddered to a halt between floors, and the sudden silence was deafening. Please, Mildred whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't see anything. I won't say anything. I just want to go home to my daughter. Nam's expression shifted, something almost like respect flickering across his features. You have a daughter. How old? 17. The word caught in her throat. Emma's face flashed through her mind, her bright smile, her dreams of college, her whole life stretching out before her. A life that would be shattered if Mildred didn't make it home tonight. 17, Nam repeated, nodding slowly. College soon, I imagine. Expensive. Very expensive. He leaned against the elevator wall, studying her with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining an interesting specimen. Tell me, Mildred, you don't mind if I call you Mildred, do you? I've done my research since our little encounter upstairs. Single mother, works 3 jobs, lives in a rental that should have been condemned 5 years ago. Your daughter wants to study medicine at NYU. Full ride, no scholarships, you're looking at $300,000 you don't have. The casual recitation of her life's details made Mildred's blood run cold. He'd had her investigated. In the span of, what, 30 minutes? An hour? How much power did this man have? I don't understand what you want from me, she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze even though every instinct screamed at her to look away, to make herself smaller, invisible. Nam smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You saw my laptop. You saw financial records that most people wouldn't understand if they stared at them for a week. But you understood them in seconds. You spotted the discrepancy, the mismatch in the quarterly reports. He pushed off from the wall, taking a step closer. Do you know how rare that is? How valuable? I'm just a cleaning lady, Mildred protested, but even as she said it, she knew how weak it sounded. How untrue. You're a woman with a master's degree in finance from Columbia who made one mistake. Nam held up a single finger for emphasis, one mistake that cost you everything. A recommendation for a bad investment to the wrong client, and suddenly you're unemployable in the industry you spent years trying to break into. So you clean toilets and scrub floors and pretend you're invisible because it's the only way to survive. Am I getting warm? Mildred's silence was answer enough. He'd done more than basic research. He'd dug into her past, excavated the failure she'd spent 3 years trying to bury. Here's what's going to happen, Nam said, his voice dropping to a tone that was somehow more terrifying for its calmness. You're going to work for me. $8,000 a week. All you have to do is what you did upstairs. Look at numbers, find the problems, tell me where the money's actually going versus where it's supposed to be going. Simple financial consulting. For a crime syndicate, Mildred said flatly. Nam's smile widened. I prefer to think of it as an alternative business structure, but yes, let's call it what it is. You'll be analyzing the finances of a criminal organization. You'll be complicit. You'll be guilty of conspiracy and about a dozen other charges that would send you to prison for the rest of your natural life if anyone ever found out. He paused, letting that sink in. But no one will find out. Because you're smart enough to know what happens to people who talk. The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but crystal clear. Mildred thought of Emma, of her daughter's laughter, of the way she'd looked that morning at breakfast, young and innocent and full of hope for the future. A future that required money they didn't have. Money that Nam was offering her. And if I say no? She had to ask, even though she already knew the answer. Nam's expression didn't change, but something cold and dead flickered in his eyes. Then you know too much, and I can't let you leave this building. It's nothing personal, Mildred. Just business. The elevator suddenly felt very small, and very far from anywhere safe. Mildred stood in front of the bathroom mirror, dabbing at the coffee stains on her yellow jacket with a damp cloth. The fabric was cheap polyester, the kind that absorbed everything and gave back nothing. Just like this place, she thought bitterly. Through her phone propped against the sink, her brother Jerome's face filled the screen, his expression tight with worry. You look tired, Millie, he said, using the nickname only he was allowed. When's the last time you slept? Sleep. She laughed without humor, scrubbing harder at a particularly stubborn stain. That's cute. You try sleeping when you're surrounded by people who consider murder a business expense. Jerome leaned closer to his camera, his voice dropping. Then come home. This job isn't worth your life. And go back to what? The words came out sharper than she intended. She softened her tone, meeting his eyes through the screen. Minimum wage at the diner? Watching Mom's medical bills pile up while I smile and ask if people want fries with that. At least you'd be alive. The stain wasn't coming out. Of course it wasn't. Nothing in her life came clean anymore. She'd crossed too many lines, seen too many things, become too valuable to men who measured human worth in percentages and profit margins. I'm already dead if I leave, Jerome. The only question is whether I die broke or die rich enough to take care of you and Mom first. Jesus, Millie. My first official meeting is in 20 minutes, she cut him off, checking her watch. A cheap Timex that looked ridiculous next to the Rolexes and Patek Philippe's she'd be sitting across from. Constantine wants me in the conference room. Says it's time I understand what I'm really protecting. Jerome's face went pale. What does that mean? It means I'm about to find out how deep this rabbit hole goes. She gave up on the stain, tossing the cloth into the sink. The yellow jacket would have to do its job despite the imperfection. Just like her. It means I'm either about to become invaluable or expendable, and I won't know which until I'm already in the room. You don't have to do this. But she did. They both knew it. The moment she'd accepted Constantine's offer, the moment she'd walked into this fortress of glass and blood money, she'd signed a contract written in invisible ink. The terms were simple, perform or perish. There was no middle ground in this world, no comfortable mediocrity. You either rose or you fell, and falling meant a shallow grave in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. I have to go, she said softly. I'll call you after. If you can, Jerome said, and the unspoken words hung between them like ghosts. If you're still alive. If they let you. If you haven't become one of the disappeared. She ended the call and stared at her reflection. 27 years old, and she looked 40. The fluorescent bathroom lighting turned her skin sallow, highlighted the dark circles under her eyes she'd stopped trying to conceal. But her eyes themselves, those were sharp. Alert. The eyes of someone who'd learned to catalog every exit, every weapon, every potential threat in a room before anyone else had finished their coffee. Intelligence was her only armor now. Not the yellow jacket with its pathetic coffee stains. Not her cheap watch or cheaper shoes. Just her brain, firing faster than the men around her, seeing patterns they missed, connecting dots they didn't know existed. In a world where everyone carried guns, she'd learned to carry something more dangerous, information. She slipped her phone into her pocket and headed for the door. The hallway stretched before her like a gauntlet, each step bringing her closer to the conference room where Constantine and his inner circle waited. Where every word she spoke could be her last. Where one wrong observation, one miscalculated recommendation, one moment of weakness could end with her joining the long list of people who'd outlived their usefulness to Viktor Volkov. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their electric buzz a constant reminder that she was always being watched, always being evaluated, always one mistake away from becoming a cautionary tale. But fear was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. Fear made you hesitate, and hesitation made you dead. So Mildred Foster, former waitress, current financial analyst for the most dangerous crime family in New York, straightened her stained yellow jacket and walked toward the conference room with her head high. She had no weapons, no backup, no escape plan. Just her intelligence and the cold calculation that she was worth more alive than dead. At least, she had to bet her life that Constantine still believed that. She reached for the conference room door handle, and for just a moment, allowed herself one final thought. This was either the beginning of real power or the end of everything. There would be no middle ground. The conference room felt smaller than it had any right to be. Mildred sat in a leather chair that cost more than her monthly rent, watching Daniel Park pace like a caged animal. His Hermes tie was slightly loosened, the first crack she'd seen in his armor, and his jaw worked silently as he stared at the architectural models lining the wall. "Let's cut the bullshit," he finally said, spinning to face her. "You waltz in here with zero credentials, somehow charm Victor into giving you access to our most sensitive projects, and within 48 hours you're finding errors that supposedly escaped 3 levels of review." He leaned against the table, eyes narrowed. "So either you're incredibly lucky, or you knew exactly what you were looking for." Mildred's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Park said, his tone sharp enough to cut glass, "that maybe someone fed you information. Maybe you're working with one of our competitors. Maybe this whole wide-eyed act is just that, an act." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Mildred thought about defending herself, explaining her background, her years of catching details others missed. Instead, she pulled out her phone and opened her notes app. "The cryptocurrency routing through Singapore," she said quietly. "You're using the wrong subsidiary." Park's expression didn't change. "Excuse me?" "The Singapore holding structure you've set up for the crypto transactions, you're routing them through Sterling Global Singapore Holdings. But that entity has different tax treaty benefits than Sterling Singapore Investment Holdings." She looked up at him. "It's a 3% difference in withholding tax. On a project this size, that's roughly $8 million over the first 5 years." The color drained from Park's face. "How the hell would you know that?" "Because I read the entire corporate structure document while I was waiting for my background check to process." Mildred stood, walking to the whiteboard. "You have 17 Singapore entities. Most people would assume they're interchangeable, but they are not. Each one was created for a specific purpose, with specific tax advantages." She drew a quick diagram. This one was set up for real estate transactions. This one for equity investments. And this 1 inch, she circled it, was specifically structured for cryptocurrency holdings because of how Singapore classifies digital assets. Park pulled out his phone, fingers flying across the screen. Mildred watched him pull up documents, his face growing increasingly pale as he cross-referenced her claims. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "The legal team used the template from the Dubai project. They didn't even." He cut himself off, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "We're 3 days from finalizing this structure with the monetary authority." "So fix it," Mildred said simply. Park looked at her like she'd grown a second head. "Do you have any idea how many contracts this affects?" "The investor agreements alone are still in negotiation," Mildred finished. "I saw the timeline. You have 72 hours before anything becomes binding. It's tight, but it's fixable." She returned to her seat. Unless you'd rather keep accusing me of corporate espionage instead of solving the actual problem. The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Park's carefully constructed hostility crumbled, replaced by something harder to define, a mixture of grudging respect and pure frustration. You're either the best analyst I've ever met, he said finally, or you're dangerously overconfident. Why can't I be both? A ghost of a smile crossed his face before disappearing. Victor thinks you're some kind of savant. He's been singing your praises to the board. And you think I'm a threat? I think you're an unknown variable in a very controlled environment. Park sat down across from her, his posture finally relaxing slightly. I spent 5 years building my reputation here. Every analysis, every recommendation, every projection has my name on it. And then you show up and start finding mistakes that make me look incompetent. Mildred understood then. This wasn't about her credentials or Victor's favoritism. This was about a man watching his carefully constructed empire develop cracks. I'm not trying to replace you, she said. I'm trying to help the project succeed. By making me look like an idiot. By catching errors before they cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars. She leaned forward. You can either see me as competition, or you can see me as someone who spots things others miss. Your call. Park studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he pulled out his laptop and opened the Singapore entity documents. Walk me through it, he said. Everything you saw. For the next hour, Mildred explained her findings in excruciating detail. Park listened, asked sharp questions, and slowly, reluctantly, began to see what she saw. By the time they finished, the sun had set over Manhattan, casting long shadows across the conference room. I still don't trust you, Park said as they gathered their things. I don't need you to trust me, Mildred replied. I just need you to listen. The city below had transformed into a constellation of lights by the time Mildred realized they'd been working for 6 hours straight. Her third cup of coffee had gone cold an hour ago, untouched beside her laptop as numbers cascaded across dual monitors, wire transfers fragmenting and reforming like digital origami across 7 different jurisdictions. Route the Singapore funds through the Cayman shell first, Nam said from across the conference table, his voice rougher now, stripped of its earlier precision by exhaustion. Then split them between Luxembourg and Dubai before they touch US soil. Mildred's fingers flew across the keyboard, restructuring the flow. The architecture they were building was beautiful in its complexity, a financial labyrinth designed to make Sterling's money untraceable while keeping it technically legal. Each layer they added was another wall between him and whoever wanted him destroyed. The timing matters, she murmured, more to herself than to him. If we move too fast, we trigger reporting requirements. Too slow, and the window closes. You see it. Nam leaned forward, and something in his expression had shifted. The professional distance he'd maintained all evening had eroded, replaced by something rawer. Most people look at money like it's static. You understand it's a living thing. She glanced up, meeting his eyes across the scattered papers and empty coffee cups. The office felt different at this hour, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the vulnerability of shared secrets. They were building something illegal together, or close enough to illegal that the distinction didn't matter. That kind of complicity created its own gravity. Show me the Korean accounts again, she said, pulling her focus back to the screen. Something's not right about the timing on those transfers. Nam moved to her side of the table, leaning over her shoulder to point at the spreadsheet. He smelled like expensive cologne layered over exhaustion, cedar and something darker, more personal. There. That 48-hour gap. We need to collapse it. Can't. Korean banking regulations require a holding period for foreign transfers over a certain threshold. She pulled up another window, fingers already working the problem. But if we split it into 3 smaller transfers and route them through different banks? They arrive simultaneously on the other end. He was nodding, already seeing the solution. You're fucking brilliant. The profanity felt like an intimacy, a crack in his perfectly maintained armor. Mildred felt something shift in her chest, not attraction exactly, but recognition. She'd spent so long being invisible, being underestimated, that having someone see her competence felt almost physical. They worked in silence for another hour, the only sounds the click of keyboards and the occasional scratch of pen on paper as Nam sketched out new routing structures. Mildred's eyes burned, her contacts feeling like sandpaper, but she couldn't stop. The problem had hooked into her brain, and finishing it had become more important than sleep or comfort or common sense. Done, she finally said, sitting back so hard her chair rolled. 7 countries, 14 banks, 32 individual transfers. They all converge in 72 hours, and there's no way to trace them back to the source. Nam studied the final architecture on her screen, his expression unreadable. Then he reached up, loosening his tie completely and unbuttoning his collar. In the harsh fluorescent light, Mildred saw what he'd been hiding, intricate tattoos crawling up his neck, disappearing beneath his shirt. "Each one is a person I've lost," he said quietly, catching her stare. His fingers traced the edge of one, delicate script in what looked like Korean. "My mother. Cancer, when I was 19. Mildred didn't know what to say. The confession felt like payment, like he was offering something valuable in exchange for what they'd built together tonight. This one, he touched another, a small geometric pattern behind his ear. "My best friend from university. Car accident." His finger moved lower, to a lotus flower. "A girl I loved who made the mistake of loving me back. What happened to her?" The question escaped before Mildred could stop it. "She learned what I really do for a living." Nam's smile was bitter. "Some people can't live with that knowledge. The smart ones leave." The implied warning hung between them. "I'm showing you who I am. Be smart." But Mildred had stopped being smart the moment she'd accepted Sterling's offer. Maybe even before that, when she'd started stealing from Westfield Capital because being invisible had become unbearable. She was already past the point where smart mattered. "It's almost 4, Nam said, checking his phone. "We should both get some sleep. Sterling will want a full briefing in the morning." Mildred nodded, but neither of them moved. Outside, the first grey hint of dawn was bleeding into the sky, turning the city's lights pale and ghostly. They'd built something together in the darkness, not just a financial structure, but an understanding. A recognition that they were both the kind of people who operated best in shadows, who found beauty in complexity and danger in connection. "Thank you," Nam said finally, "for understanding the work." She knew he meant more than the spreadsheets. The hospital corridor reeked of antiseptic and desperation. Mildred sat on a plastic chair that squeaked every time she shifted, her hands trembling in her lap as nurses rushed past with grim expressions. Through the small window in the surgery door, she could see shadows moving, doctors working frantically on her brother's body while machines beeped their mechanical warnings into the sterile air. "Ms. Chen." A doctor emerged, surgical mask hanging loose around his neck. His eyes held the weary sympathy of someone who delivered bad news several times a day. "We've stabilized him temporarily, but he needs immediate surgery. The bullet nicked his femoral artery. Without intervention within the next 48 hours, he'll bleed out internally." Mildred's throat constricted. "What kind of intervention?" "Vascular reconstruction. It's complicated, high risk." The doctor pulled out a clipboard, his pen tapping against the metal surface. "The total cost is $125,000. We need payment upfront before we can schedule the operating room." The number hit her like a physical blow. $125,000. She'd been cleaning toilets for $6 an hour. She'd been scrubbing floors until her knees bled. Even with Elias's generous wages at the mansion, saving that amount would take years her brother didn't have. "I don't have that kind of money," she whispered, the words scraping out of her raw throat. The doctor's expression shifted into practiced neutrality. "Then I suggest you find it quickly. 48 hours, Ms. Chen. After that, we can't help him." He turned and walked away, his shoes squeaking against the linoleum with the finality of a closing coffin lid. Mildred stared at the surgery door, watching her brothers still form through the window. Michael. Her baby brother who used to climb trees in their backyard and skin his knees every summer. The kid who'd cried when their mother died, clinging to Mildred's waist like she was the only solid thing left in his collapsing world. He'd made mistakes, terrible ones, but he didn't deserve to die bleeding out on a hospital bed because she couldn't scrape together enough money. Her phone buzzed. A text from Elias, "How is he?" She couldn't answer. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she shoved the phone back into her pocket and stood, legs unsteady beneath her. The hospital's fluorescent lights made everything look washed out, like she was moving through a nightmare that wouldn't end. $125,000. The number circled her mind like a vulture. She thought about the penthouse, about the luxury that dripped from every surface. She thought about Elias's casual mention of $5 million deals, the way he discussed money like it was nothing more than air, abundant and meaningless. And then she thought about the organization. Her stomach twisted. She'd been working for them for 3 weeks now, shuttling information between dead drops and collecting payments from terrified business owners who paid protection money with shaking hands. The envelopes were always thick, always cash. Last week alone, she'd handled over $200,000 in a single pickup. The money was right there. Accessible. She knew where they kept the collection safe, a reinforced room in the back of a restaurant that served as one of their front operations. She'd been there twice, watched the combination being entered. The organization trusted her because she'd proven herself reliable, because she kept her mouth shut and her head down. Stealing from them would be suicide. Everyone knew the stories. The accountant who skimmed $2,000 and turned up in the river 3 days later, his fingers broken one by one. The runner who tried to pocket $500 from a collection, they'd made an example of him in front of the entire crew, methodical and horrifying. The message was always clear: betray the organization, and death would be the kindest outcome. But Michael was dying. Mildred walked to the hospital's vending machine, fed it crumpled dollar bills, and watched a candy bar spiral down without really seeing it. Her reflection stared back at her from the machine's glass, hollow-eyed, exhausted, trapped. She could ask Elias. The thought surfaced unbidden, and she immediately shoved it down. He'd already done too much, already compromised himself by keeping her secret. How could she possibly ask him for $125,000? What would he think of her then? Some desperate woman using him as a personal bank account? No. She couldn't ask him. Wouldn't. Which left the organization's money. Right there. Enough to save Michael's life and condemn her own. 48 hours. The clock was already ticking. Mildred pulled out her phone again, staring at Elias's unanswered text. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard, and for one wild moment she considered telling him everything, the whole desperate, impossible situation. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she typed, "He needs surgery. Expensive. I'll figure it out." She hit send before she could second-guess herself, then turned off her phone and walked back toward the surgery ward. Through the window, Michael lay motionless, machines breathing for him while doctors consulted in hushed tones. $125,000 or her brother's life. The math was brutally simple. The consequences would be catastrophic. And somewhere in the darkness of her exhausted mind, Mildred Chen began calculating exactly how to steal from people who made corpses out of thieves. Nam Ki-jun had never believed in divine intervention, but the cryptocurrency transfer he executed at 3:47 a.m. felt uncomfortably close to prayer. The blockchain route was so convoluted it would take a team of forensic accountants 6 months to even find the starting point, through a defunct Cayman Islands shell corporation, bounced through 3 Estonian crypto exchanges, converted twice, then funneled into the hospital system as an anonymous charitable donation earmarked for pediatric oncology research with immediate application to patient Lee Minute-jun. Untraceable. Invisible. The way Mildred had once been. He told himself it was strategic. A good manager invests in his assets. But at 4:13 a.m., still staring at the confirmation screen, he knew he was lying to himself the same way other men lied about their first kill, pretending the wait felt different than it did. The surgery happened on a Wednesday. Nam learned this from Mildred's carefully neutral expression during their morning briefing, the way her shoulders sat just slightly lower, the first full breath he'd seen her take in weeks. She said nothing about the miracle funding, and he said nothing about knowing. They discussed the Singapore accounts and the Seoul property acquisitions with the same clinical precision they always had, as if his chest didn't feel like someone had reached in and rearranged his organs into an unfamiliar configuration. She discovered the truth the way she discovered everything, through relentless, methodical investigation that made her so dangerous and so valuable. 3 days later, she appeared in his office at 11 p.m. without knocking, a tablet in her hands and something volcanic in her eyes. "The crypto trail," she said, her voice surgically steady. "Sloppy work for someone of your caliber. You left a timestamp signature on the Estonian exchange." Nam leaned back in his chair, studying her. She was vibrating with something, rage, maybe, or fear, or that peculiar combustion that happened when both tried to occupy the same space. Sloppy, or intentional? "Don't." The word cracked like a whip. "Don't play games with me. Not about this." "Then say what you came here to say, Mildred." She moved closer, and he could see the yellow edge of her jacket beneath her coat, that fucking jacket she wore like identity, like defiance. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to buy my loyalty with my nephew's life. You don't get to make me owe you something this big. I don't want you to owe me anything." "Then what do you want?" She was shouting now, actually shouting, and Nam realized with a strange detachment that he'd never heard her raise her voice before. "Because this isn't charity, Nam. Men like you don't do charity. Everything is leverage. Everything is control. So tell me what you want, because I need to know what I'm paying for." "You." The word left him before he could stop it, raw and unpolished. "I want you." The silence felt like falling. Mildred stared at him, something crumbling in her expression. "As what? Your employee? Your strategist? Your... my equal." Nam stood, closing the distance between them with measured steps. "You stopped being an employee the moment you looked at my books and didn't run. You're not my maid, Mildred. You haven't been for a long time. You're my strategist, my partner, and the only person in this entire diseased world I would trust with." He stopped, the words too dangerous even now. "With what?" "With knowing me." It felt like ripping out his own spine. The real version. Not the performance. She was crying now, silent tears tracking down her face, and it was the most terrifying thing he'd ever seen. "You're going to get us both killed." "Probably." He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Is that a no? You're a criminal. A genuinely bad person who does genuinely evil things." "Yes. And her voice broke. "I'm becoming one too. That's what this is. That's what you're offering. Not salvation. Damnation." "I'm offering you visibility," Nam said quietly. "I'm offering you power. I'm offering you a place in this world where you are seen and valued and protected. Where people know your name and understand what it means to cross you. If that's damnation, then we'll burn together." Mildred closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, something had shifted. Some last defense had crumbled. "Chief Financial Strategist." "What?" "That's my title. Chief Financial Strategist. With full signatory authority on the Southeast Asian accounts and a seat at every strategic planning meeting." Nam felt something unfamiliar move through him, relief, maybe, or triumph, or that dangerous thing that felt like joy. Done. And the Interpol investigation? Already handled. It'll go cold by Friday. She nodded slowly, and he watched her make the choice, watched her step fully into the darkness he'd been offering since that first day she'd looked at his books without flinching. "Then I'm in. God help us both, I'm in." When she left his office 20 minutes later, her yellow jacket was visible, bright and defiant against the Seoul night. Nam watched her go and understood with perfect clarity that he'd just made the most strategic and most catastrophic decision of his life. Some women wore armor made of steel. Mildred Jin wore hers in highlighter yellow, and it made her the most dangerous person he'd ever known. In the criminal empire of Nam Ki-jun, love and death had always been the same thing. Now he finally had someone who understood the theology. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe for more stories like this. See you in the next video.